Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us today for our program called COVID-19 and Rare Disease Patients. Over the next hour, we're going to examine what's at stake for nearly 30 million Americans living with rare diseases. We'll explore the critical scientific research landscape they rely on and the impact of the pandemic on this community and this research. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Harmony Biosciences, for supporting today's really important and interesting conversations. Nearly 1 in 10 Americans today is living with a rare disease. More than 90% of these illnesses currently lack an FDA-approved treatment. For many, access to treatments and breakthrough developments from clinical trials can mean the difference between life and death. How has the pandemic impacted Americans living with rare diseases, especially as clinical trials have slowed or become more difficult to conduct? And how are scientific and medical communities prioritizing rare disease research amid competing health concerns? And what can Congress do to ensure disruptions and access barriers don't undermine research and don't undermine treatment progress? We're going to be putting all these questions and more in front of our fantastic speakers, but first a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events, and more importantly, use the hashtag #TheHillRareDiseases. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Don't throw away your computer, don't throw it out the window, just refresh the page. They tell me that'll fix your problem. I am very hopeful it does. My first guest is Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey. He's made rare disease innovation a real priority on Capitol Hill and recently sponsored legislation called Cameron's Law to encourage greater investment in researching and developing rare disease treatments. I spoke to him a short while ago. Let's take a listen.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. Listen, I think the rare disease area is one that's very interesting. I have known people who have, and their children who have suffered from various rare diseases, and it's one of the most lonely and frustrating challenges a parent can have, or anyone can have, because there's so little infrastructure, so little kind of smart economics, behind it. And I really empathize. I'm so happy the Hill is doing this program today. I'm also kind of blown away by you in the fact that you brought Annette Leo, a mother of 2 sons. She has rare disease, who have rare diseases, as your guest at the State of the Union address in 2019. So you put a human face on this. And you're also a champion for a 6-year-old guy named Cameron Hyman. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this field and about the human side of what we're talking about today?
Well, and the fact that you said and started with exactly the right comment that you've got 30 million people who live with some form of rare disease. 90% we don't have any cure for them, right? And so it's often a lonely place and a really hard place. Obviously, not just for the person with the rare disease, but for their family, right? And who their caretakers and caregivers. My mom, believe it or not, had a rare disease. We lost her a few years ago, and they knew a little bit more about her rare disease than some others, but not much. And it was really frustrating because you kind of knew there was no cure. And what you hoped for was that there was enough incentives for those in the R&D space, our phenomenal life sciences companies and all of our scientists, to actually want to and be able to afford to invest in cures and finding cures. And the challenge I discovered pretty fast was that unless we help them in some ways to do it, it's prohibitively expensive to research a lot of these rare diseases, right? And that was a huge challenge, and one that I immediately decided to start tackling when I got into the Congress.
Well, tell us a little bit about Cameron and Cameron's Law. Does it fix the financial problem?
Well, part of it, believe it or not, years ago, and it was under President Reagan, that we first came up with orphan drug tax credit. And, and more than 770 new medicines have been approved over the years from the tax credit, which is really just an incentive to some of our life sciences companies to make those investments. You help them pay for it, right? To help pay for that research. And what happened in 2017 in the tax bill, we actually cut it in half from 50% to 25% coverage which to me was inhumane, that you would actually cut this tax credit that incentivizes some of this discovery. So I've met several families in my district over the years now, especially as I started to speak out about the importance of investing in rare diseases, which, as you know, often lead to finding all these other cures, right? So one thing leads to another. We saw this, by the way, with COVID, right? That some of the things we had done the research for then led us to actually other discoveries, which ultimately led to the vaccine. And when
Right.
it wasn't if most of that research that had been done wasn't actually to beat COVID-19. It was for other, right? It was for other things that we've done.
Well, you're building on science and taking advantage of, other things. It's usually, I tell people most progress is not earnestly achieved. It's done through bank shots,
Exactly.
So I, and it raises another interesting question. I think, look, I get my metaphors all wrong on this stuff, but I sort of feel like the FDA and the corporations and the science and research community are kind of like all dancing together. Sometimes the dance goes well and sometimes it's really crappy. And we've had COVID in 2 years, and the COVID has really, in the rare disease area, disrupted the process by which research occurs. Clinical trials occur. A lot of clinical sites close down. Now, some things happen in response. We got telehealth, we got home visits, because you've got to have a community of people who are in fact afflicted with a disease, which becomes a community of concern and a community of research. But if you can't connect them, you can't meet the clinical end trials of the FDA. I'm just interested in whether or not there are pieces of that you think we could focus on. I want to tell folks, Josh Gottheimer is not only kind of Mr. Bipartisan and problem solver in Congress, you were problem solver at Microsoft. Like, you understand companies and information and how you kind of bring together complex systems. Do we need to do something to the complex system of how we do drug research in this area?
Well, you're spot on the fact that during COVID, because of COVID, we had to stop a lot of our clinical research. So it set back a lot of our ability to keep moving forward. Now we're going to get some of those trials, I'm hoping, back going again, but that put a big freeze on a lot of this research, which is not good. And the Leos in my district, and which are people who you talk about the State of the Union. A couple years ago, Annette Leo, she was my guest, the mom, and two kids, Nick and Matt. Unfortunately, we lost Nick from complications of his disease, rare disease, last year at the age of 23. And wonderful, like two wonderful. You would never meet two people with a bigger heart. But if we don't actually get back on this, on going after these rare diseases and using this ingenuity and taking chances, you have to be willing to take shots on goal and fail. That's how this whole thing works. And my fear is if we don't incentivize it and we don't do everything we can to encourage our great life sciences companies to take those shots on goal, we will never discover, never find the next cure. And that, to me, is what is, when you talk to these families, so frustrating. So I've been pushing very hard to reinstate this tax credit to get that 50% back, to allow those investments to occur again. It's very, very important. We've got the greatest life sciences companies in the world here. Sometimes people, as you know, are critical of our great companies, and it drives me crazy. A lot of them are based in Jersey, are great companies, right? That make these discoveries, right? Like for the vaccine, we should, and what we learned from MNRA, we should be celebrating all of this research instead of taking shots at these great scientists who come up with these discoveries. So, Steve, there's one thing I'd say is we got to actually get the incentives back, and we have to build up every system possible to encourage us to take these chances so that we can have the next discoveries like we have.
Well, I've been following, I understand the logic of the tax credit side, but one side of, in anticipation of talking to you, I called a couple of, the players in this research in rare diseases. And I said, what really matters? What's hit you during COVID? And they said, look, the FDA is really trying to work with us, trying to find ways to be nimble and deal with the fact that our way of doing, trials and research has been impacted and affected. But what hasn't changed is the clock, that there's a clock and you get exclusivity for so long, as I understand it. And, this is kind of like an exogenous shock, act of God. COVID comes in and hits us, no fault of any particular player. Everybody's adjusting. But it seems to me, look, and I may be getting something real wrong here, folks. So if I am, I'm sorry. Why not just put pause on the clock? And, that's not a budgetary thing. It's like in this area of rare diseases in which the dynamics of the economics are so fragile, Why not stop the clock until after, the COVID crisis ends, and then
you're saying the clock on
exclusivity, so that the drug research they're doing,
right,
and what they're doing and investing in, they don't get any extension of that exclusivity in this time period, but they've lost a pretty significant amount of time.
By the way, seems to make a lot of sense to me. What you're saying.
I'm just like going to what can you do a non-budgetary way to give?
It seems to make a lot of sense to me. In fact, that's kind of what I was getting at before.
Well, if you want to call it the Gottheimer bill rather than Clements bill, you're welcome to
name it after you, Steve. I mean, I think we should be looking at any which way we encourage investment in these rare diseases. So if what you're hearing and what I've heard is more of the frustration that we've had to actually stop a lot of the research. You're bringing up another angle to this, which I'm really going to look into right away, which is because we've actually had to stop a lot of the research, we should also stop the clock on taking away exclusivity. That makes a lot of sense too. I mean, anything we do that disincentivizes investment in these rare diseases, to me, is a huge negative and hurts the families like that we named Cameron's Law after, and Cameron, who's this wonderful woman, young little girl in my town that I live in, who is battling a rare disease and Sanfilippo syndrome. We have to. So I love that idea, and if that's actually what's going on, which I've not heard from the advocates about, but I'm going to immediately do research on. If that's what's going on, then certainly that's something that we should pursue right away. I mean, the FDA in a lot of ways, as you know, is frustrating. So I'm all for ways of fixing it.
Josh, there's another element here. And again, I'm back in metaphor land, Dr. Seuss. I'm not sure I should mention Dr. Seuss, but there's that, great cartoon in the past, we're here. And I sort of feel like the rare disease area is sort of like that. We're here, we're matter. People have, some sliver fall within some of the ranges of rare diseases. Rare diseases hit 10%, 1 in 10 of Americans, but yet this does not get the airtime, does not get the attention. I'm glad we're doing this at the Hill. I care about this subject, but the truth is it still lays at the fringe of many of the discussions that we talk about on the health side. And I'm just interested in whether or not there's some sort of, this is unfair to you, but you're a political conceptualizer. What can be done to bring this topic less from the fringe, less from, that elephant who's trying to say, hey, I'm here, and then, make it more substantial in terms of the attentions that we should be giving the aggregate number of Americans who are afflicted with this kind of thing, and kind of create a greater structural presence. Is that a fair question?
It's a very fair question. I mean, and Fred Upton, who's the co-sponsor of my bill with me, we talk about this. Like, how do you actually put this front and center? Because to your point, Steve, everyone knows somebody who's dealing with it. When you have 30 million Americans, everybody knows somebody, right? And what I think we need to do, and the advocates do a great job on this, but they're also very busy taking care of people, right? Often.
Yeah.
So it's up to us to put this front and center and to make sure we say, here's why you should care. You may not know somebody with a rare disease, but by the way, look at all the other diseases or challenges we've solved because of what we've learned in a rare disease. And thank God for the discoveries we came up to. And you got to make this personal for people. And I've learned this, right? This is, to your point, how does this affect your life? And thank God, how many people came up to you and said, it's amazing what we did on the vaccine, right? I mean, it's just amazing, and of what we did in a short period of time. As frustrated as we are, we came up with a solution. And it's all because of this. And I think this is why we need to actually show people, if you pull back from this, if you don't incentivize it the right way, we're not solving the next disease. We're not going to be prepared for the next pandemic. And that's why I think it could be tied nicely to that.
Okay, another area of interest, and again, I have no complaints or criticism of the NIH, and Francis Collins is stepping down. I'm just wondering if there isn't an opportunity here to ask ourselves what's missing in the research area. There's money, you've got a lot of this industry in your district. But I remember when then Vice President Biden launched the cancer moonshot, the shtick he had of that was that there were more silos than people knew in the research area on cancer. And that we're going to put dissimilar players, from the information industry and SAP and Microsoft in the room with, cancer clinics and cancer centers, and somehow the synergy of that would matter. And I remember when I first met you at the Microsoft Science Fair years ago, and you'd go see these really brilliant innovations that had nothing to do with what Microsoft was doing. They were all outside. Whether or not there isn't an opportunity here to say, hey, with the private sector, let's begin looking at some of these other side players who've innovating in different ways and begin looking, because when I look at the rare disease area, it's an economic problem, because you have small scale, small incidents, serious impact on people's lives, but the way our economy, it doesn't scale well. But in a world of information, in a world of personalized medicine and kind of zeroing in on people and the efficiency you get out of the information, isn't there something we could be doing or thinking about differently in this area that we might not have done so before?
I mean, you're making such an important point, which is how do we bring these worlds together that are doing so much and change and helping change the world so fast? How do we actually bring them together? And you're right. The president has talked about the cancer moonshot again. He's been talking about it lately. I think they did something at the White House a couple of weeks ago on it. And I've got a piece of legislation that I'm working on. Actually, Brian Fitzpatrick and I have working on have worked on a childhood cancer bill that's out there. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be bringing together the Microsofts and the Googles and of the world that are, and all these, frankly, there's lots of companies doing AI that are really cutting edge and using all this mass information and trying to apply it in a different way now with our life sciences. And it's amazing if we actually gave that a shot and worked together instead of against each other, what we could probably pull off. And the people I got to meet when I used to work at Microsoft, these scientists and people working on things. I mean, even during COVID, one of the engineers from Microsoft called me and they had this heat map of where it was breaking, of where the outbreaks were by community. And it was looking at the data in a way. I brought it to our governor. I said, look at this data, like that we hadn't really ever, that we're not looking at COVID in this certain way. You could cut it and you could try to figure out where it's coming next. We should be, that was just because using all the power of a certain tool that Microsoft has, and but all these companies have, and we should be bringing them to you. To your point, we should be deploying them. You're right. We're not doing it enough, and that's the only way we're going to solve some of these problems. I met some the other day. There's this new test for cancer, which is, have you heard about this new diagnostic test they've come out with? And you literally, it looks at DNA. You send blood out, and it can detect up to 70 different cancers that we don't have screening for, including, right? So it's a whole new thing. The president actually talked about it, but then I met with him, they explained it to me. It's pretty amazing. And we're trying to see if we can get it covered so that other people can take it. But those are the kind of evolutions that we're having that only come out if we actually put our mind to it.
Well, it's really fascinating to hear. Look, March 1st is coming up, which is going to be the President's State of the Union address. Again, I'm going to be up there in the hall somewhere listening. You're going to have guests again. Who are you going to invite this year?
I think they're not letting us have guests.
Oh, that's right. That's a bummer. My apologies. Of course not.
I just want to be able to go, so they told us that we're allowed to go, which, by the way, that's a change from the year before. So I'm very happy about that. So unfortunately, we can't have guests this year.
Yeah, well, I will be in the hall up there, so I'll wave as you walk by.
So you could be my guest.
Yeah, well, I'll actually be working, and maybe I'll put a microphone in front of you. Well, Congressman Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey, member of the Financial Services Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, but I think very importantly, he is co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus and a real leader on these issues we're talking about today in rare disease. So, Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Have a great one. Okay, good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And now to explore how healthcare providers and patient communities can work together to improve rare disease treatments, I'm pleased to be joined by a real great panel of experts. Annie Kennedy is Chief of Policy Advocacy and Patient Engagement for Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Paige Rivard is CEO of the Prader-Willi Syndrome Association USA, where she advocates on behalf of patients with the genetic multisystem disorder. For awareness, Prader-Willi Syndrome Association USA has a relationship with this event's sponsor, has shared information on their clinical trials. I think that's great. And Dr. Mustafa Sahin is the director of the Translational Neuroscience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. He specializes in studying rare genetic disorders that can cause autism and intellectual abilities. Thank you all for joining me today. Paige, let me start with you. And you are a parent of a child who has two genetic disorders. And my understanding is that Prader-Willi syndrome is in our community in America about 20,000 cases. Maybe that's global. I don't know whether it's global or domestic, but I'm trying to give our audience an understanding of the size of community. It's a limited number of people, which changes the dynamic. And I am very committed today to kind of having people share the human story side of this. You're a mom. You've been dealing with this. Can you just give our audience an understanding of some of the stress points, particularly during COVID, that you and your family have had, and what other families who have those who suffer from rare diseases are experiencing in this time?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me, Steve. Yes, I am a mom. My son is 11. He is in 5th grade. He has two genetic disorders, Prader-Willi syndrome and neurofibromatosis, or NF1. And, 11 years ago, we had never heard of either of these. I should say my husband is a physician. He's heard of them, but we had no knowledge of what it was like to live with a rare genetic disorder. So it has impacted our lives greatly, changed our lives completely, to be very honest. I come from a banking world. My last 20 years of my professional life was in banking. I actually had to quit my job because I traveled a lot for that job. I couldn't continue with taking care of my son. And so, it has impacted us from that perspective. It's also impacted his sibling. We have a daughter who is 23, and, she obviously 11-year span difference between them, but she grew up with, our son's name is Jake, and just learning to live with this. She's actually chosen a career that's going to be working with special needs individuals, but it's greatly impacted our family. COVID has really impacted our family as well as, all of the rare disease community. There have been a lot of things, from just travel to care, clinical trials. The biggest impact for our family is really in school. March 2020, I took this role and my son's school went remote. And so I had to figure out how to juggle a new job and how to help him access his education via, remote learning. He was not good at remote learning. It was a big struggle for him. He requires an aide with him daily. So we had a lot of struggle. He has actually regressed quite a bit. So we are now in the process of tutoring just to try to catch him back up. He's in 5th grade, but we're doing, in addition to school, he has his tutor twice a week. He also has multiple therapies, occupational therapy, speech, physical therapy that he goes to. So it's been interesting, and it's been a journey. And I think you talk to any rare disease family, and it's very similar.
Well, I'm very grateful that you shared with us a lot of that, the challenge and the stress of that. And Annie Kennedy at the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases, I'm interested in this report that you generated covering, as I understand, if my notes are right, about 379 rare diseases affecting 15.5 million people in the United States, and looking, to kind of look at the burden again, almost $1 trillion of extra healthcare burden on those people in this space. And I think there are two dimensions, from my conversation with Josh Gottheimer, as this comes into greater clarity for me. There's the stress on the family, on the patient, that Paige just shared with us. Then there's the stress on research, getting people to clinical trials, getting, to clinical endpoints, getting to what the FDA requires. And I'd love you to kind of share with us, given your role in helping to look across this, what are the elements we really have to fix and get to know, particularly with the impact of COVID?
Yeah, I'm delighted to. And first of all, I love that whole conversation that you had with Representative Gottheimer, and that juxtaposed with what Paige just shared. The whole reason we did that study that you just described was because we know that families, like Paige's family, like my family, like so many families, know inherently the costs of living with a rare disease are largely actually absorbed by families. So much of what Paige just described are costs that are not actually reimbursed by the healthcare system. But we actually spend a lot of time in Washington talking about direct costs, talking about investment, and talking about costs in the healthcare system. But we have actually never done formalized studies actually looking at what the whole cost of living with a rare disease is. The other thing that you actually were just speaking about previously was really important, and that rare is actually not rare. And that while we talk about an estimated 30 million Americans living with rare disease, we believe that's a conservative estimate because that's based on the people we can count, those we have what are known as ICD codes for, International Classification of Diseases codes for. And the reason we only looked at 379 diseases is because we don't have ICD codes for all 7,000 to 10,000 rare diseases. So many patients in the system or many rare disease community members are invisible in our system. So we had to start somewhere. So that $1 trillion number that we talked about was in 2019, so before the pandemic, before costs actually exacerbated for families. And 60% of those costs are costs incurred directly out of pocket by families. They're not the costs that you see in inpatient, outpatient visits. They're not prescription costs. They're the unreimbursed costs that are required for caring for an individual or yourself if you're living with a rare disease that are directly out of pocket for families. And what we've also now found through that data is that the economic impact of rare diseases is equal to or greater than most chronic diseases in the US. And why this is so important for us is because the investment into solving for these rare diseases at NIH, at FDA, and other public health programs is de minimis. And so it's really important to us that we begin to shift that conversation and talk about the fact that rare is not somebody else's problem. It's not just the concern of our rare disease community, family members. It should be an economic priority for Americans, for all of us, to really invest in rare disease research and resources in the same way that we've invested in solving for the pandemic and cancer and diabetes and many of the conditions that matter to all of us, because rare disease matters to all of us.
Really, really important observations. Dr. Sahin, at Boston Children's Hospital, I learned that the very first patient admitted to your hospital with COVID was actually a rare disease patient who lived in a shared facility. It's just a reminder of some of these conditions that can be such a challenge. But I'm interested in something Josh Gottheimer talked about and kind of the world that you're both in treating patients, but you're also part of the research community. And Josh Gottheimer said, hey, we need to keep getting shots on goal, shots on goal, shots on goal. My question to you is, what's getting in the way of getting more shots on goal in the rare disease arena?
Well, there are a number of obstacles. The important point scientifically is that many of these rare diseases are genetic diseases. And we know from the revolution that occurred in genetics and the technologies that we can identify these patients with remarkable precision to the base pair that they have this potential variation in their DNA. And that allows us a whole slew of potential therapies. So in terms of being close to therapies, rare diseases are an amazing opportunity for us. Having said that, because of not having the infrastructure, but also lacking the funding for these rare diseases, we're not able to take those shots on the goal. We have to take more shots on the goal. There's no question about that. But it is very difficult for these disorders to convince large pharmaceutical companies, if they don't have enough patients, for instance, for that disease, to be commercially interested in that disease. It's also very difficult for investigators to get funding from the NIH for clinical trials for these rare diseases. There's a number of obstacles that are in the way. And I think if we take that global perspective of the amazing impact of these diseases, combined with the unique opportunity that they might be more amenable to treatment with the technologies that we're developing, that combination, I think, makes the very strong argument that we have to take more shots on the goal, both from funding perspective, but also from the infrastructure perspective. And it's going to take not just industry, it's not going to take just academia, it's not going to just take patient advocacy organizations, but a combined effort for a combination of these rare diseases. The other point I want to make is that for many of these rare diseases, we are taking one disease at a time approach. And that really creates, as you understand, the number of rare diseases that we're dealing with, a potential limitation to what we can achieve. If we can leverage what we learn from one disease with a larger group of diseases, if we can look at comparative studies among these rare diseases, we might be able to make progress in a quicker and more efficient way. So I'm particularly interested in efforts, maybe global efforts like the cancer initiatives that President Biden started, that takes a bigger picture perspective of looking at a number of rare diseases together.
Look, Doctor, I'll address this to all of you. I've been moderating healthcare events now, I don't know, probably for about 20 years. Before the iPhone was around, before we had a lot of the technology that surrounds our daily lives, before telehealth was a big deal. And I just sort of always felt like each year, incrementally, both technology, community building, communications, commuter networks, everything was moving in a good direction, getting a little bit better, a little bit bolder. We were getting greater efficaciousness, even in things like cancer. But now I have to say that, from the data I've been looking at, the last 2 years have been horrible and almost a reversal, where you look at things like clinical trial participation and enrollment in areas. And I've got data that shows, in year-over-year data in, according to therapeutic areas, endocrine areas, 80% decrease in participation during this COVID period, cardiovascular 70% decrease, oncology 48% decrease. And so to me, those are staggering numbers. And I guess my question is, how much of a gut punch, how wobbly are our efforts in research now? I think before we could kind of had confidence in incrementalism. What do we need to fix now? Because this seems like some gaping wounds in our research momentum and in our footprint, our connectivity with patients. And I think part of this is asking the question today of whether the public policy community here in Washington should do something to fix the impacts of this so that this fragile funding and research system doesn't come undone. I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I wanted to get it out there. This is a real serious time. But let me just start with you, Doctor. Do you feel that there have been serious impacts from COVID?
The impact of COVID on research has been huge, and we're just starting to feel it. It's going to have a downstream impact for a number of years, not just on ongoing current trials, but also on the training and upcoming leaders of the field in the future are going to be affected with the COVID pandemic and their research. I mean, just to be very clear, as of March 2020, our lab completely closed. We couldn't do any research experiments in the lab. It took us several months to get back up to where we were, and we're barely really coming back to where we were before the pandemic in terms of the experiments that we were hoping to do. So from that perspective, the impact has been huge. From clinical trials perspective, many clinical trials had to stop because patients could not travel. So just for our trial, which was on a rare disease that happened around April 2020, we had to change completely our assessment system from in-person assessments to telehealth assessments, and we had to do that within weeks. And with the passionate commitment of the patients in that particular rare disease, we were actually able to finish that trial. So I'm very proud that we learned some things and we were able to pivot very quickly and finish that trial. So there are some actually learnings from COVID that I think will help access to clinical trials going forward, including telehealth, including access, including doing trials in a different way that we might be able to get results quicker. But I'm extremely worried about the impact of COVID on research, especially clinical research, including the training of our next generation of leaders who are going to continue this research in the future.
Thank you. Paige, I'd love to get a snapshot from you as well as to how the community you're working so hard to support has been impacted. And I guess I want to ask you a question, which is, as you advocate for patients in your network, as you're trying to raise resources to build a community, what do you need all of us to do? What of us outside this? What would make your world move forward more constructively? What would be some of the things on your roadmap that you want the world to hear?
Well, as Dr. Sahin mentioned, obviously clinical trials have been impacted greatly, in the rare disease community. We are in a good place for Prader-Willi syndrome. We actually have a lot of pharma companies interested in the disease and working towards clinical trials. But I think, we have a limited number of population to participate in those trials. So education about clinical trials is important. Also, as he said, we all have to work together. We have been to the FDA a few times. I believe they have a good understanding of the unmet need of Prader-Willi syndrome, but we really need to do more and work harder and faster. So it's going to take all of us. It's going to take the advocacy groups. It's going to take the medical groups, academia, everyone to really take an interest and understand and have a desire to do the research that's going to be needed to give our loved ones, their best life possible.
Thank you. Annie, finally you, and then we've got an audience question for you. But Annie, I want to tell our audience that you helped lead legislative efforts around, I think it was the MD CARE Act, the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. You know legislation and you know lobbying. You know what this town can do and you know what this town's limits and failings are. But I guess the question I have from a structural, I was just asking Josh Gottheimer, should the clock stop on exclusivity? Is that does that change the game at all on the research side, for those companies, who may or may not be investors in this, where there's a fragility, I understand, in this arena. But from a legislative perspective of looking at that architecture, maybe we're going to lose our audience because we're going to get wonky right now. But, I think the question is, what are the items on the agenda that you think matter to this topic that we should know about, that we should think about? Josh Gottheimer mentioned a few, but what's on your playlist?
I love this question. And we actually have about 1,300 advocates coming to the Hill next week to talk about this. This matters a lot to us. And I don't think we'll lose the audience because I think this matters to people. I think the concept of time is really important in rare disease. Time is a commodity to our families and those living with rare disease. And I love the idea of stopping the clock as far as exclusivity is concerned, but the clock will not stop for somebody who is living with a rare disease, who daily is facing irreversible disease progression. And one of the things that happened, as my co-panelists were talking about, as we saw delays and the trials stop, and the same people at FDA and NIH who were having to apply themselves to the urgency of the COVID pandemic, as they should have, were the same people who typically are reviewing and moving forward products in rare disease. And what happens when those pipelines stall and slow is actually a generation of patients with a rare disease will lose the opportunity to benefit from that pipeline. So not only are we talking about a generation of future researchers, we're talking about a generation of children or adults who could have benefited from a therapy, and we don't get that back. And so when we talk about potential solutions, the first thing we have to do is we have to protect the incentives we already have that are working. So you were talking earlier to Representative Gottheimer about the orphan drug tax credit. It's working. And there have been proposals made recently that will disincentivize or harm the existing orphan drug tax credit incentive. We cannot take additional cuts to the orphan drug tax credit. We have to make sure that the companies working in our space continue to invest in our space and incentivize them further. The accelerated approval pathway and regulatory review pathways that are tailored to rare disease and targeted rare diseases are working. We have data to show that. We need to protect and strengthen those pathways and continue to incentivize researchers, investors, therapy developers to come into the space. But the other thing we saw happen during COVID is we saw rapid real-time data sharing occur that we believed previously couldn't happen. And we need to see that continue. Some of the early symptoms we learned were associated with COVID. The loss of taste came from patient registries. So we saw patient experience data informing the clinical trials and the regulatory decisions. We need to see more of that in rare disease, in real-time decision-making. And we need to see regulatory statute that supports that. Patient experience is data. It is quantifiable and it counts. And I know you'll have panelists on later that talk about that. But that regulatory certainty is needed for companies to have confidence they can proactively pursue these innovations. And we need legislation that gives them cover to do that. So overall, we just need more investment, more hope, more innovation, and more access for the rare disease community.
Well, I think that just grew our audience because audiences love to hear specificity and roadmaps. And so thank you very much, Annie. We have an audience question from Alec Stone. Alec?
Thank you. As the Public Affairs Director for the Oncology Nursing Society, the professional organization that represents the interests of the 110 U.S. oncology nurses, I witnessed our members serve on the front lines of this public health emergency. The pandemic continues to have a devastating impact on patients, particularly those with immunocompromised systems. Now, more than ever, rare diseases, including rare cancers, need to have the support of federal agencies in order to find breakthrough treatments and cures. As the most trusted profession for 2 decades in a row, how can nurses help educate public officials and regulatory agencies in these areas?
What a great question. Thank you, Alec. So, Dr. Sahin Mustafa, how can nurses be brought into this equation constructively and effectively?
Nurses have been an incredible partner in this process, not just in the clinic, but also on the research side. We couldn't do much of what we do without the nurses. I started our rare disease clinic with just one nurse back in 2002, and she's been with us as a pioneer in this field, if you will, for the past 20 years and knows that community better than I do. So I think she's been a member of the patient advocacy group, clinic committee, for instance, and working in that role. I agree completely that nurses are an important population to bring into this. I also want to highlight the fact, as was mentioned by the nurse colleague, that individuals with rare diseases, because of their medical conditions, have been carrying a disproportionate portion of the infections with COVID, and not just because of cancer, but immunodeficiencies, genetic forms of immunodeficiencies, genetic forms of lung disease. And also remember, about 3/4 of the rare diseases affect the central nervous system, the brain. So that comes with developmental delay, intellectual disability, autism, weakness, all reasons that you might be more vulnerable to this COVID pandemic. And those patients and those families have been disproportionately affected with this pandemic, unfortunately. So bring that to the forefront, having policy colleagues come and see our specialty clinics, seeing our patients, seeing the research that we're doing, I think would be a very powerful way to get the word out. And programs like this, obviously, hopefully will be another way to get the word out about this disproportionate burden that these families are carrying during the pandemic.
Right. Oh, Paige and Annie, I would love to get your quick thoughts on the role of nurses as well. Paige?
Sure, I agree with Dr. Sahin. Nurses, are integral in everything we do, all of our clinic visits, but I think just the continued education and spotlight on rare disease. I know our organization does a lot with NICU. A lot of our patients are diagnosed in the NICU, so we constantly are reaching out and trying to educate NICUs and nurses and anybody we can. So for us, I think it is the continual education piece that needs to happen.
And finally, Annie.
Yeah, I loved the question. I think nurses are a trusted entity, right? You were talking earlier about really there's some public distrust, public confidence. We've had a lot of different messaging coming from a lot of different places during the pandemic. But there are some workforces that are undeniably those who were heroes and continue to be during the pandemic and that people trust. And I think as the rare disease community really grapples with what happens during this phase of the pandemic, we know the pandemic is not over. And as mask mandates are being lifted and people are trying to return to whatever this new normal looks like, a lot of the members of the rare disease community, for all the reasons our panelists talked about, are really scared and are really worried about what this means for us. And I think the more that we can partner with trusted organizations, trusted entities, trusted workforces and communities around public messaging, around the fact that mask mandates may not be lifted for all, around what safe looks like for some members of our community, the better that will be for all of us. And that is something that I love the question and really excites me to think about what types of partnerships and collaborations we could think about looking forward.
Terrific conversation, terrific question. Alex Stone, thank you so much. I really want to thank our panelists, Annie Kennedy, Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement for the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. Please go check out their reports, fascinating and important. Paige Rivard is CEO of the Prader-Willi Syndrome Association USA, and Dr. Mustafa Sahin is the Director of the Translational Neuroscience Center at Boston Children's Hospital. Really appreciate your time. What a great conversation. I hope we don't just have these conversations around World Rare Disease Day, which folks is on Monday. I hope we can have them other times during the year and take this seriously all year long. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
And now for a message from our sponsor, Harmony Biosciences. I'd like to introduce Kate McCandless, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Policy at Harmony Biosciences.
Hello, I'm Kate McCandless, Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs and Policy at Harmony Biosciences. At Harmony, we believe that where empathy and innovation meet, a better life begins for people living with rare neurological diseases. That's because both empathy and innovation are integral to the life-improving treatments we explore. They are also integral to a better future for patients and their communities, for healthcare providers, and for all of us. We start by listening to those living with rare neurological diseases and what they share about their lives, the challenges they face, and what they hope for in the future. And then we use those insights to ensure that the treatments we investigate and develop have the potential to improve their lives in truly personal, relevant, and meaningful ways. I am pleased to be here today with Maria Peconi, the CEO of Trend Community, a digital health analytics company that she co-founded with her husband, Chris, after their daughter was born with a rare genetic disorder. Trend's technology analyzes social media conversations to understand the diseases from the patient and caregiver perspectives. Like Harmony, Trend believes that listening with empathy can lead to breakthroughs for people living with rare disorders. Thank you for being here with us today, Maria.
Thank you, Kate and Harmony Biosciences, for inviting us to share our insights on this very important topic.
Maria, Trend has continued to work through the pandemic to learn more about the needs of a wide range of rare disease communities. Can you tell us what communities have you engaged with, and what types of conversations are people living with rare disorders having about the impact that COVID-19 has had on themselves or their families?
Well, since we launched Trend in 2017, we've partnered with around 50 rare and chronic disease communities to analyze the stories and real-world experiences they share on social media in order to gain valuable insights into the challenges they face on a daily basis. These include rare neurodevelopmental disorders such as GLUT1 deficiency syndrome, autoimmune inflammatory conditions like gout, and rare degenerative diseases such as Friedreich's ataxia. COVID-19 has had a profound impact on these communities, even beyond the struggles that we've all experienced. Some anecdotes really left an impression on me. Especially early in the pandemic, those with pre-existing conditions like a rare disorder heavily weighed the risks and benefits of even going to the hospital or the emergency room for care that they required. They were concerned that they might contract COVID while they were there. For example, the Fabry community faced challenges getting to infusion centers to receive enzyme replacement therapy. People also discussed medication shortages and not being able to fill vital prescriptions. And then once the vaccines became available, these community members discussed the pros and cons of getting vaccinated. For example, people living with chronic urticaria were fearful that the vaccines might trigger a relapse or exacerbate their hives.
Does the data give us any insights into how people living with rare disorders are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic? And how has this conversation shifted over time?
COVID-19 triggered or exacerbated the symptoms of several chronic diseases, making it even more difficult for communities to manage their pre-existing health conditions. To make things worse, patients must travel, sometimes incredibly long distances, to receive the medical care they require from specialists or centers of excellence that understand and are equipped to treat their conditions. Many of these centers closed, and of course, travel was not an option. And so many of these communities suffered profoundly because of this. Conversely, the ability to schedule telehealth visits positively impacted many for whom travel is always difficult, either due to physical limitations, cost, or because caregivers must make arrangements for someone to care for their other children while they accompany their medically fragile child to an appointment. Unfortunately, now those state of emergency telemedicine licenses are being revoked. And once again, people are weighing the pros and cons of traveling to get the care they need. We also saw an uptick in memberships as COVID-19 symptoms overlapped with these communities: pericarditis, PANS pandas, chronic urticaria, to name a few.
So what decisions do people living with rare diseases say that they weigh when they're considering clinical trials, and how does the pandemic play into those decisions?
Yeah, good question. I think that one of the biggest considerations is travel. Most clinical trials require several visits. For the reasons I mentioned previously, this can be incredibly difficult for a family to pull off. Even when travel costs are covered, caregivers must make arrangements for someone to care for the other children in their family while they're away. Medication washout is definitely another consideration. For some, the meds that they are taking offer the only relief from their debilitating symptoms. And even if a new therapy shows promise for a brighter future, some patients don't want to sacrifice the benefits they get from their current treatments. And generally, there are multiple clinical trials running concurrently, and people must make the difficult decision to participate in one trial over another. We've observed a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions around clinical trials in general, as well as specific protocols. The FDA has allowed some sponsors to modify their trials to make them more accessible, which of course we love, but now we see that these modifications and updates take time to make their way to the community. With an increase in televisits, which overall is a very positive thing, I do think we need to find better ways to communicate protocols and medication regimens more broadly. We found that steps can get missed or patients can leave confused when they don't have the opportunity to discuss their care face-to-face with their doctor.
So for those people that are enrolled in a trial, what important considerations are being shared in the rare disease communities?
The thing about social media is that information can spread wide and far very quickly. We've seen the negative side of this with the proliferation of misinformation, but it is also a vehicle to spread awareness and education. During this pandemic, we've all had a crash course in clinical trials and regulatory approvals. We're witnessing the lightning speed at which vaccines and treatments can be approved. The rare disease community paved the way for this and desperately wants these learnings to inform the next generation of clinical trials. For people already enrolled, I think the biggest consideration is that we are still living in a pandemic, and we want and need the accommodations that were made available. This includes televisits whenever possible, in-home visits when face-to-face care is required, and flexibility for patients to travel to the site that is most convenient to them, even if that means traveling a longer distance so that they can work with their current medical care team. Communities have also found their voice and are demanding to be heard by drug companies and regulatory agencies such as the FDA. We need to continue to find platforms to bring all stakeholders around the table to discuss the future of clinical trials. We, along with a diverse group of stakeholders, recently sat down with the FDA to discuss symptom-focused basket trials. These would be clinical trials that can enroll people with different rare disease diagnoses who experience the same or similar symptoms. The meeting left us hopeful that we will find a path towards more flexible and inclusive clinical trials, but also realistic. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to get there. I hope that once the pandemic is behind us, that we will continue to focus our efforts on bringing treatments to the patients who need them as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Maria, for joining us today and for all that Trend Community does on behalf of the rare disease community. Clearly, there is more that we need to do and learn through this pandemic to continue to reach those who are living with rare diseases. On behalf of Harmony Biosciences, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thanks so much, Kate and Maria. My next guest is Congressman Brad Wenstrup from Ohio. He's been a physician for more than 30 years, and he's co-chair of the GOP Doctors Caucus. I spoke with him a short while ago. Here's my conversation with Brad Wenstrup.
Congressman Wenstrup, thank you so much for joining us. I think part of our job today is to focus in on how the healthcare ecosystem that we have, including the rare disease community, 1 in 10 Americans, suffering with various ailments that are challenging these times, but COVID has made everything worse. But I know that you kind of look at the broad side of what's happened to this ecosystem. And I'm wondering what you're most worried about at this moment right now about delivering affordable, dependable health to Americans, and what's on Brad Wenstrup's radar screen.
Well, there's a lot going on in that arena, obviously. And as a physician, this is really important to me. And I always want to focus on being patient-centered, and that we're looking at, how patients are affected with decisions that we make in Washington or whatever the case may be. I think all those are important. You mentioned rare diseases, and I kind of want to look at all diseases, but rare diseases are a little bit more challenging sometimes, because the numbers aren't there. There are not as many people being affected by this. You saw what happened with the pandemic, and boom, we come together on Operation Warp Speed, and we develop a vaccine, right? So something that's smaller in nature, not seen as much, sometimes gets left aside. But I think the voices of people with rare diseases are being heard a little bit more today. And we want to focus on cures or increasing quality of life for patients. How you maintain someone. I often use the term, Steve, where I say, we focus on lifespan, and outside of overdoses and suicides, we really do pretty well at keeping people alive. But let's focus on health span. How do we keep people healthier longer? Even if you have a chronic illness, how can we keep you healthier longer to where you can enjoy your family and go to work and do things like that? And then when it comes to cost, that's really where a lot of the savings is. The healthier you can keep people, the better off we are. So we should be looking at things in terms on the government side of dynamic scoring. And I like to use the example of the cure for hepatitis C. Well, without that cure, you're getting a lot of treatments, hospitalizations, eventually a transplant. A cure may cost a little bit more and cost something up front, but the savings is huge on the other end. So we've got to have our mindset around that and see the big picture. So
let me just interrupt there, because I think it's such an important point, but I want our audience to understand what you mean by dynamic scoring. And what I think you mean is that we are able to, from a budgetary perspective, look at those savings as something that helps offset the cost of investment. Do I have it right?
You got it right. I mean, so if you cure something that normally may cost $250,000 a year in hospitalizations, et cetera, but you can cure it for $8,000. Yeah, that $8,000 looks like an expensive treatment, but what did you save on the other end? And that's the same with not necessarily just with cures, but how do we keep people living at least a healthier lifestyle? Even if they have a chronic disease like diabetes, keep it under control. You're less likely to develop a lot of the side effects of that, like neuropathy, et cetera. So how do we maintain? And a lot of that is new drugs, new treatments, new innovations. So we don't want to do things from the government side that deter innovation. But what if you had payment from, say, government programs where you say, well, if it actually works, we'll pay you for it. Okay, for that particular drug. So then there's a lot of onus there, but on the manufacturers, et cetera, but you want to get to something that's actually giving a benefit that's good for everybody. So we also, we have the Rural and Underserved Healthcare Task Force out of Ways and Means Committee that is bipartisan. Now you're getting into access to care and things like that, right? So it's affordability is part of it, but a lot of times, you could have Medicaid, Medicare, you've got an affordable plan for you. Medicaid, no cost, but you can't get to a doctor. So we're engaging with things like telehealth. And, one of the things we learned, Steve, from the pandemic is you can't just focus on one thing. And that's a problem as a nation. And I kept saying, America needs to hear from the doctors that are treating COVID patients, but also need to be hearing from the doctors that are hearing from their patients and dealing with the depression and the isolation and the suicides and the domestic violence. And then, to me, just as important, the missed diagnosis. In other words, not a misdiagnosis, not an incorrect diagnosis.
Right.
it was never made, because we're telling people, don't go to the hospital. You got to look beyond just this virus for the betterment of the country and its health.
Well, you raise a really, really important point, which is about that physical dimension of just seeing people and doing things. And you and I have talked about it before, about elective surgeries, key ones being put off during COVID. Well, another part of it on the research side, because I am interested in how, I used to be interested in how a bill becomes a law, and now I'm interested in how, a drug becomes a drug, or how you get it out there, particularly in this area where you've got a lot of rare disease need. But the economics are complicated and the timing is complicated. And guess what? Clinical trials are complicated if you had test sites shut down. You had people that couldn't go so which telehealth kind of rose in response. But it's been an interesting thing during this, period of time where lots of the research in the rare disease area has been, I would say, to put it mildly, met a lot of speed bumps. And I think, the view of the industry is that the FDA has tried in many ways to meet it. But it raises something I had never heard of, which is the exclusivity clock, whether or not we need to give, we need to understand, it's not a budget issue. It's just whether, given this time that the research process, whether we need to begin looking at how much exclusivity they get for the investment they're making during a time period when they couldn't function normally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And, there's just a lot of things involved, too, with innovation. If you talk to anybody who gets a drug to market that actually is working, they can tell you what their portfolio looked like when they started and how many things that they had out there that failed and how much was invested in that. So a lot goes into getting a drug to market, and usually it's a success at the end of many failures. What was interesting, like Operation Warp Speed, when it came to the trials, we opened it up. The trials were taking place all across America. And so you were not just site specific. And so that was very helpful for us to try and figure out if a vaccine was working. So there's many things out there that we can do, that we should continue to do. We have the orphan drug tax credit. I think that's important, because when you come up with this, unique drug for a unique illness, we got to give you a break, because you had to invest a lot, and it's not like your other drugs that you're then going to go out and sell to hundreds of thousands of people across the world necessarily. You're in a very small market, but it's very important, because, as patients, when we want to keep our eyes on patients and what they're doing and what they're feeling, it may be a rare disease, but when you have it, it's 100%.
Well, look, one of the areas I'm very thankful to you personally for is, you as co-chair of the Doctors Caucus, and because you kind of like some of the stuff I do, have opened the door to a lot of other members of Congress that are part of the Doctors Caucus. So I have talked to a great number of people, because you've helped me reach Democrats and Republicans and talk about it. You've launched lots of bipartisan efforts on everything from surprise billing, deals in hospitals, et cetera. But I have talked to people on both sides of the aisle right now and say something like surprise billing, and again, getting back to the patient, what they're experiencing. And you have some concerns about how the Biden administration is ignoring all of that. So what's the terrain right now between the White House and Congress, bipartisan Congress, in the health legislation space?
Well, if you use surprise billing as an example, we wrote a law in a bipartisan fashion with support of every healthcare provider in the House of Representatives and Senate, on bipartisan means, Republicans and Democrats. We wrote it in such a way that we had a position where we wanted to take the patient out of this surprise bill. You go to the hospital, you're treated, emergency appendectomy, whatever the case may be. Guess what? The surgeon on call isn't in your network. We take you out of that equation. Let this be between the surgeon or the hospital and the insurance company. So we set up an arbitration method that we thought was fair, and that's the one that passed. The process that was rejected was then put in place by the White House, and when they went to their rule.
Say that again. So the process that you folks voted against actually became kind of became the norm, because the White House didn't do what the law says. Is that right?
That is correct. And we made it very clear to the White House before they went into their rulemaking what our bill says. So it wasn't like they just misinterpreted the intent. They deliberately changed the law as written, because what they put in place is what we rejected in the House and Senate. So this is very disturbing on that front. But I will tell you, on other areas, we sit down in bipartisan fashion, speak with the Surgeon General, concerns that we have, healthcare provider burnout, all of these types of things that are important, because if you don't have providers, you don't have care. And that's an important thing that we need to continue to address. And these are things that we do in a bipartisan fashion. And to that point, Steve, if you look at the end of the last term, we put in 1,000 new residency programs. What most people in America don't know is, one, we aren't graduating enough physicians, and two, they don't all have residency programs. So now you've got $200,000 in debt and no residency program to go to. I don't know what you do with that degree necessarily without that specific additional training. So we're trying to address those issues. We haven't had to put one of those bipartisan issues per se like that in front of the White House, but I hope we get the opportunity to, because there are many areas of concern on both sides of the aisle of things we can address, like training more physicians.
Let me ask you this last question, and I don't know how to get it just right, folks, but it occurs to me, as I've kind of have dived into this subject on rare diseases, that those Americans, those people around the world, those Americans who are suffering it, are often in very small communities. And they could be stigmatized. They could be a very lonely experience. We're talking at the federal level and orphan drug law and all this stuff. It just kind of, it reminds me of our discussion together about, folks that served in Iraq, served in Afghanistan, came back, mental health challenges. There's a kind of mental health dimension as well to this, is you have a lot of people that are lonely. And I just like to talk to Brad Wenstrup, the doctor, not Brad Wenstrup, the congressman. What is your advice to people who are suffering from this? Because it can be a long and lonely and complicated road to getting help and support when you're one of a very few people in a community.
Well, that's a good point. And so, we want to expand things like telehealth and remove barriers, whether it's transportation or whatever, to get to the right type of provider that can actually take care of your condition or do the best that they can. On our front, we do want to expedite. We pass bills like right to try, new drugs and things like that aren't necessarily approved yet, but we really, that's a little bit complicated on the paperwork end, the administrative end, unfortunately. We can clean that up, but also, we want to let people know we are looking into, and if there are some opportunities or hope on the horizon, that we can get them to you. ALS is probably a good example, and I don't think ALS is even as rare as some of the others that are out there, but ALS, you have patients that are they're sitting in their home and they're watching themselves slowly die. And there may be some drug out there that they're reading about, and there are some, and like, why can't I get that? Why can't I get that? That's on our end to try and expedite that type of a process. But we want them to have hope and have someone to talk to, and not feel like, the old school leper, right? That you are cast aside. That's not what we want for anybody. So we're trying to be as patient-centric as we can and try and solve some problems, whether it's bureaucratic or innovation and research, and expedite these types of things that can help the health of all Americans and all people around the world.
Well, I just want to tell our audience, whenever I call Congressman Brad Wenstrup and say, let's have a smart conversation on any policy issue, not just healthcare, you always say yes. And we really have a good time together learning from me. We learned from you, and we're very grateful. So Congressman Brad Wenstrup, Republican from Ohio, former doctor, served this nation abroad in the Iraq War. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, co-chair of the Doctors Caucus. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Appreciate the opportunity.
That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to Harmony Biosciences for its support of these conversations, and to all of you attendees for joining us. For those of you who may have missed any of the conversations, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.